moving abroad. Yeah, it's a phrase that just conjures up so many like romanticized images, right? Adventures, picture postcard kind of stuff, discovering hidden gems, maybe even reinventing yourself.
Yeah, like a whole new you.
Right. It's like we've all seen those like glossy Instagram reels.
Oh, absolutely.
But what about the stuff that like doesn't quite make it to the curated feed, right? The nitty gritty. What about that? So today we are really diving deep, literally, into the less talked about side of packing up your life.
Exactly.
And just starting over in a new country.
Yeah.
Going beyond that initial excitement, that honeymoon phase.
Yeah.
What happens after that?
Yeah, and I think we are lucky enough to have some really insightful firsthand accounts that we're going to be looking at.
Exactly.
To really explore what it means to actually build a life somewhere else. Primarily, we've got blog posts and articles from people who've moved to Spain and the UK.
Awesome.
So yeah, think of it as getting the inside scoop.
I like that.
Straight from the source about, all the emotional and social changes.
Yeah.
Even practical stuff. And that's really our mission here, to give you, the listener, a much fuller picture.
Okay, so let's set the scene. You've arrived in this new country. You're probably riding that wave of like initial excitement for a little while.
Right.
Everything's new and shiny.
Yeah.
Soaking up the culture. Maybe indulging in amazing food, whatever that looks like for the place that you've moved to.
Yeah.
Right. But pretty soon, real life kind of has a way of creeping back in, doesn't it?
It does. That's so true. And Toby Wilkinson, who we'll talk about a lot in this deep dive, I think he just puts it perfectly. He talks about that initial expectation of constant novelty. Right. So like a vibrant social scene, all these new exciting things to do and see and try. But then eventually it gives way to just everyday life.
Yeah.
The boring everyday, as he calls it.
The boring everyday. I love that.
Yeah. It's like you're still working, still got to get groceries. You're still, living.
Yeah.
And that routine comes back.
But what's cool, though, is that he also points out this interesting kind of flip side to that. That there's this surprising novelty within those like mundane tasks. Right?
Yeah. It's really fascinating. It's like a jolt to your senses almost. Because even something as basic as like going to the supermarket.
Right.
It becomes this whole exploration.
It's all new.
Yeah. New products. You don't recognize the brands. Everything's packaged differently.
Even the layout of the store.
Yeah, exactly. And even just walking down the street and noticing the architecture, all the little details, it just hits differently when it's all brand new.
It's like the mundane becomes an adventure simply because it's unfamiliar.
Yeah, love that.
Right. So we've touched on this idea of everyday life abroad, but we can't really talk about moving to a new country without talking about language.
Right.
This is a big one. You might have spent hours on Duolingo or whatever your app of choice is.
Right.
And you might feel somewhat prepared. But the reality is that actually having to use the language to navigate real life conversations, it can be a bit of a shock, can't it?
It's completely different. And again, Wilkinson kind of nails this when he describes it as like this second language headache.
Oh, the second language headache.
I mean, it's just that mental exhaustion you feel just from constantly translating everything in your head, even the smallest things.
Yeah.
Right. Imagine trying to ask for directions when you're not even sure if you're saying it right, or following a conversation between locals. It can be so draining.
It sounds exhausting.
Yeah, it really is.
And your brain is in overdrive all the time, just trying to keep up.
Absolutely.
But there must be a flip side to that, right? I mean, that intense immersion, being thrown in the deep end, as Wilkinson puts it.
There is. It's actually really beneficial. While it is overwhelming at first, it forces you to adapt quickly. Right. You pick up phrases, vocabulary, everything much faster in real time. And this is something that RVF International talks about as well. It's like language learning apps are great, but they can only take you so far.
Of course.
Right, because they don't really prepare you for the nuances of how people actually speak, you know?
The dialects, the slang, the pace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's no replacement for that daily immersion.
And Wilkinson even notes that eventually that initial struggle with the language, it actually shifts, right? It becomes less of a barrier and more of a tool for connection.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a real turning point.
And it's a shift from surviving to thriving almost.
Right.
You can communicate more freely, build relationships.
Sort of connections, yeah.
Understand the culture on a much deeper level.
Yeah.
And just feel that sense of belonging.
Totally.
So let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about the practicalities of settling in. We've talked about language. But there's a whole emotional side to moving abroad as well, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And one thing that comes up time and time again in a lot of these personal accounts is loneliness.
And it's a really important point to acknowledge. It's a big one. Wilkinson, he's very open about his experience with this, particularly in those early months. And he highlights how making new friends, especially as an adult, it's already kind of tricky.
Yeah.
But then you add this whole new social landscape and it's amplified.
Right. Everyone's unfamiliar.
Yeah. And Sarah, another person who shares her experience, she talks about this hidden cost of loneliness, which I think is such an apt phrase, because when you're just focusing on like getting your bearings, figuring everything out, it can be really hard to prioritize building those social connections.
Yeah, and those kind of casual, everyday social interactions that we might take for granted back home, they suddenly become, well, not so easy.
Exactly.
It sounds really isolating, especially when you think about, it's supposed to be exciting. You're surrounded by all this new stuff. But yeah, you can still feel lonely. So, people do find ways to combat that, right? To build new lives, to build a social life.
They do, and it often takes a proactive approach.
Yeah.
Wilkinson talks about finding community through sport, through padel, which is huge in Spain.
Right.
And using apps to meet other players, which I think is such a smart idea, finding those shared interests. And then RVF International, they really emphasize online expat communities.
Right.
Groups like American Expats in Spain, for example. It's a way to connect with people who get it, who understand what you're going through.
Yeah.
And that can be so helpful.
Yeah, and that can be a real antidote to culture shock.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, speaking of, is a phenomenon in and of itself. It's more than just noticing that things are different.
Right. It is. It's deeper than that.
Yeah.
RVF International actually defines it as, and I'm quoting here, those feelings of uncertainty, confusion, or anxiety that can arise when you're in a totally new cultural environment. And it's not just a fleeting thing, it's a whole process that you go through. And while we might kind of brace ourselves for the big cultural differences like language, customs, the obvious things, it's often the little everyday things that really catch you off guard.
The little differences?
Yeah, it's death by 1,000 cuts almost.
What kind of little things are we talking about here?
Well, if you're moving from, say, the U.S. to Europe.
Right.
The metric system.
Yes.
24-hour time. Little things like, how do people queue?
The queuing thing gets me every time I travel.
It's so different everywhere.
It is.
Even just like the way shops are laid out, the brands you see, it can be surprisingly disorienting.
Yeah.
And if you're driving on the opposite side of the road,
oh my goodness,
that's a daily adjustment. And all these little things, they just kind of add up and contribute to this feeling of being outside your comfort zone.
It's constant. That's the thing. It's just this constant low-level kind of hum.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Of having to adjust and adapt.
Right, yeah.
And on top of that, dealing with potential loneliness, like we said, it's got to take a toll, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just the logistics of like setting up a new apartment or, new house.
Right. It's much more than that. The pasted text, as we call it, highlights this perfectly. They say that the mental and emotional adjustment to moving abroad often takes way longer than you'd think. And it's way more challenging than the practical stuff.
Interesting.
And homesickness, that's a very real thing.
Oh, yeah.
And they even talk about how the smallest things can trigger it.
Right.
Like a certain food.
A smell, a song.
Yeah, it can just hit you out of nowhere.
And speaking of hitting you out of nowhere, Sarah really brings home the emotional weight of all of this with her description of that perpetual fight for belonging,
Yeah, that's so powerful.
That feeling of not quite being seen as truly settled, even if you're really trying to build a life there.
Right. It's like this underlying feeling of being temporary, even when you're investing so much.
Yeah.
Time, energy, effort into making it your home. And that feeling of having to justify your presence, it can be really draining.
Absolutely. And while all of this is happening, you're going through all of this in your new country, life back home, it doesn't stop, does it?
Nope.
That in itself is another thing that can be tough to grapple with.
It's true. It's like this almost jarring reminder that everyone's moving on without you. Friends, family, they're hitting their own milestones, having their own experiences.
Yeah.
And it's hard not to feel like you're missing out.
Yeah, like you're disconnected.
Yeah, exactly. And maintaining those relationships from afar, it takes a lot of effort.
Right.
And let's face it, things change.
Of course.
Even the nature of those relationships.
So on a more practical note, moving abroad, it almost always involves some level of bureaucracy, which can be a nightmare in your own country, let alone when you're dealing with unfamiliar systems and maybe you don't even speak the language fluently yet.
It can be really daunting.
Yeah.
Visas, immigration, that's a huge one. And both the Pasted Text and RVF International, they talk about this, like navigating all that paperwork in another language, dealing with processes that are just completely foreign to you.
It's enough to make you want to stay put.
It can be. But RDF International, they do offer some good practical advice, like memorizing your passport number.
Yes, yeah, good one.
You know, just little things like that that'll make things easier. And they say, bring all your important documents with you.
Oh, yeah.
Medical records, birth certificate, that kind of stuff.
You don't have to track it down later.
Exactly. And then there's also, of course, work culture.
Oh, yeah.
Figuring out the money, the cost of living.
Finances.
It's a lot to think about.
It sounds like a lot to keep track of.
Yeah. It definitely is.
But despite all of that, and it's a lot, it seems that for many people, moving abroad can be really transformative.
It can be.
And ultimately positive in the long run.
It really can.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Not at all.
What does that look like? What does that positive side look like?
Well, you know, Wilkinson, he's a great example. After a year and a half in Spain, he says he doesn't really see himself going back to the UK.
Wow.
He talks about the personal growth he's experienced, you know, how leaving his comfort zone, it's really opened up his perspective in ways he never expected.
That's cool.
And RVF International even goes as far as saying that for some people, it can become addictive.
Oh, interesting. Addictive.
Yeah, for those who love novelty and change.
I could see that.
It just becomes a way of life.
So I think regardless of the specific, you know, ups and downs,
right.
It sounds like living abroad, it leaves a mark. It shapes you.
Absolutely. I mean, RVF International quotes Anthony Bourdain, who famously said, travel changes you. As you move through this life in this world, you change things slightly. You leave marks behind. And in return, life and travel leaves marks on you.
That's beautiful.
It is. And whether those marks are, you know, positive learning experiences or moments of difficulty, the act of immersing yourself in another culture, it just inevitably changes you.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that moving abroad, while the romantic image is certainly appealing, the reality is it's a lot more complex.
Much more.
Than just sightseeing and, you know, fancy dinners.
It is.
It's about really building a life.
Right.
And it requires adjustments.
It does.
On every level, emotional, social, practical.
Big time.
And what we've learned from these personal accounts is that it's important to be prepared.
Oh, absolutely.
Not just for the logistics, but for the emotional and social shifts.
For sure.
That are almost inevitable.
It's a given.
When you're stepping into a new culture. But it sounds like, you know, while it's challenging, it can lead to growth.
Absolutely.
Increased resilience, a broader perspective on the world. And as Wilkinson put it, it can lead to some really surprising personal evolution.
So true.
So as you think about all this, you know, the realities we've discussed, the mental fatigue, the potential for loneliness, the constant little adjustment, I want to leave you with this. What aspects of adapting to a new culture do you think would be the most surprising or challenging for you personally?
That's a good question.
Yeah, something to think about, isn't it?
It is. Food for thought.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely.
I'll catch you next time.
See you later.